I had a 2-year relationship with an undercover policeman who I knew as John Barker, and it was only many, many years later that I found out that actually his real name was John Dines. In 1987, I got involved with London Greenpeace, which is independent of the big Greenpeace. It was a broadly anti-capitalist environmental group. I met John there, and over the next 3 years, he became a close friend, and then we ended up in a relationship. He told me about his dad's death, and then he told me later on that his mum had died and he needed to borrow money to go to her funeral. He told me that he was an only child. He felt very alone in the world, that he'd lost his van and all his possessions. And all of these things were a very clever combination of both sob stories and excuses for why there was nobody around him and why he didn't have any kind of history that you could see. In reality, what I know now is that actually his mum was still alive, and so was his dad, and he had brothers and sisters. And his stories seeking my empathy and involvement in his life were actually a deliberate process of emotional manipulation in order to draw me closer to him, so that he could spy on me and the other people that I knew in London Greenpeace and other groups, and so that he could be part of undermining the political movements that we were involved with. But I didn't know any of that at the time. I felt like I'd met my soulmate. You know, we just seemed to enjoy all the same things, share all the same interests, you know, and get on great. And after a while, we rented a flat together and lived together, and we talked about starting a family. He said that he wanted lots of kids, that he was an only child, and I mean, basically just all the kind of things that you would talk about in any normal relationship. Then in the last 6 months of our relationship, his behaviour became very erratic, and he would kind of take off, disappear for the night, saying he was going walking to kind of sort his head out, and then he would come back and declare how much he loved me. And all of this was extremely emotionally draining. You know, 1 minute thinking he was disappearing, the next minute he was back. And then finally he disappeared for good. The last I heard from him was 2 letters that were posted from South Africa saying that he was sorry, but he couldn't cope with things anymore. He was going to try and sort his head out. And the last one said that if he did manage to sort his head out, then he'd come back. Now, I was actually extremely worried about his mental well-being, and I was even worried that he might kill himself, because he just seemed in really quite a distressed state for quite a while. And I was also still deeply in love with him, so I spent a long time trying to find out what had happened to him, trying to trace him. But basically everything that I investigated turned up more questions than answers. You know, I looked for his parents' death certificates in the hope that I might find out their addresses and then be able to find him through that. And actually there was no trace of his parents' death certificates, and it was just like everything that I looked at just led to more questions. But also, over a while, you know, I gradually got more and more concerned about who he might have been and what he was actually doing and why it was that I couldn't find out anything about him. And then the McLibel trial, which was mentioned, kind of got in the way a bit, and I had to get engaged with that, which was pretty much full-time from early 1993 until the trial itself started in June '94. And so I was very much focused on that. And one day coming home from court, I used to walk past the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages. At the time it was in Holborn, near the Royal Courts of Justice. And just something one day made me go in there and start looking through the death records. And what I found at that point was that John had actually been using the identity of a child who died aged 8 years old. And that basically it completely threw my life into turmoil. You know, here was this person who I was deeply in love with, who I'd lived with, who I thought I knew lots about, and actually I didn't know anything about him. I didn't even know his name. And it, you know, the whole thing threw all my other relationships into doubt. It was like, well, if someone who I've lived with for 2 years is actually doesn't exist, what's this for anybody around me? How can I know that anybody around me is real? And it really, really messes with your head. And the other thing that happened was that I became very fearful of talking to anybody about it, because I started thinking, well, maybe it was an undercover policeman. The other thing I thought was maybe it was a corporate spy, because during the McLibel trial what had become apparent was that there were, they'd actually disclosed the notes eventually from 7 private investigators that had infiltrated London Greenpeace. So, I knew from that there were private investigators infiltrating political movements. And basically what I felt was that if I talked to anybody about this, it would lessen my chances of finding out the truth, because they would try and cover up what was going on. So I very much kept it to myself, apart from talking to a couple of very, very close friends who, they kind of said, well, it's a bit unlikely that, I suppose it's possible, it's a bit unlikely. And, well, as I say, I was engaged in fighting the McLibel case, so for a while I kind of didn't really pursue it any further. I'd kind of gone as far as I could with the things that I had to go on. And then, essentially, well, I did more investigations, and eventually I found out his real name, and I found his marriage certificate, and at that point his marriage certificate said policeman, that he'd been a policeman. But even then, when I talked to my dad and close friends about it, the marriage certificate was something like 11 or 12 years before I'd had a relationship with him, and people just sort of said, yeah, but it's more likely that he was embarrassed about his background and didn't want to declare that he was a policeman when he got involved with his political group. So it's that sort of thing doesn't happen in this country. We don't have like undercover policemen spending years in political movements. That's the sort of thing you hear about in East Germany and China and Russia or wherever. That doesn't happen in democratic countries. And so, I was still extremely, well, I was wanting to know the truth. I was wanting to find him, to find out what had happened. But as I say, I'd kind of hit this brick wall. And then, around the time that Mark Kennedy was exposed as an undercover policeman, I went to visit a woman who'd actually ended up being married to an undercover policeman. And what she told me was that her partner, while she was married to him, told her that John had been an undercover policeman who was infiltrating London Greenpeace that I was involved with. And also she told me that Bob Robinson, who I had known, who was involved with London Greenpeace in the 80s, and who you may have seen in the papers last week, that he had actually been an undercover policeman whose real name was Bob Lambert. So this was all kind of happening around the same time as the Mark Kennedy stuff, and what the police were trying to say about Mark Kennedy was this was just one rogue officer, that he'd gone off the rails and it was nothing. They didn't want it. They'd never wanted this to happen, and through what had become apparent through what this woman had told me, it was obvious that actually this was much more widespread than just one rogue officer. And I got together with other women who basically had been in a similar situation, and we decided to bring a legal case against the Metropolitan Police to try and prevent this from happening to anybody else again. There are 8 of us involved in the particular case that I'm involved with. Between us, we had relationships with 5 undercover policemen over a period spanning over 20 years. So it's absolutely apparent that this was a systematic thing going on. It wasn't just like, rogue officers as they're trying to portray it. What for us this highlights is actually, it's a very sexist mindset that basically says that it's acceptable for police officers to abuse women in this way and derail our lives in order to shore up the fake identity of undercover policemen and undermine political movements. There's nothing in law that says that if a police officer suspects you of involvement in a crime, let alone involvement in political movements, that they're entitled to sleep with you in order to find out. You know, and that's for a very good reason, because it would be wide open to abuse. Any police officer could use that as an excuse to basically have sex with people unknowingly. If the police want to search your house, they have to apply to the courts for a search warrant, and there is supposed to be some scrutiny of what you're supposed to have done. But with the undercover policemen, they actually moved into people's houses for as long as 5 years. And during that time, they had free access to people's belongings. They had free access to people's minds. You know, they basically have access to your innermost thoughts without any form of protection. So, you know, for us, we're left with not knowing how much of our personal lives and thoughts are now stuck in special branch files, which is a really kind of violating feeling. But it's also very important not to let our fear and suspicion of other people undermine our own efforts too. And what we should do is, you know, try and be as open as possible and trust each other as much as possible. And also take heart from the fact, in a way, that they are infiltrating our campaigns, because actually it shows that they know that our campaigns and our struggle for freedom and justice does actually have an effect, and it does change people's minds. So basically carry on fighting for justice and don't let them get you down.